Professor Richard Kingsford is the University of New South Wales river ecologist and conservation biologist. We're speaking with him about the Murray-Darling Basin. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Ricky.
Richard, we look at the Murray-Darling Basin. Before we dive into some current issues, I'll go back to you're a member of the Wentworth group of scientists. When we look at the Murray-Darling Basin Plan as a whole, is it a plan that delivers enough for the river in your view?
Not yet. So I think it's definitely a work in progress. We'd be in a lot worse place without a Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And in particular, I think the sort of standardisation of water resource plans and the oversight by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and also the return of some environmental water are all positives. But we still have a fair way to go, and you know, it's probably not going to meet that deadline of 2024 in terms of, you know, the Basin Plan 2. So there'll need to be some discussions around all that.
Yeah, and when we look at the river, I guess it was all framed during or around the time of the Millennium Drought and serious concerns about inflows into the river through its tributaries. But now we've seen in recent years, due to a La Nina weather pattern, maybe other factors, but a lot more flow come through. Does that change anything about, I guess, the premises of the plan itself?
Not really. I think, you know, we're for sure going to get another drought. We know that happens, and we got to remember that this is really about the long game, and it's understanding what happens to this river when it goes through those droughts and floods. Obviously, this flood's been an amazing flood. It's got out to a lot of places that I never thought would be flooded again in terms of the size of the flood. But it wasn't that long ago before we had sort of massive fish kills there at Menindee as a result of, you know, really severe drought in the Darling River in 2018, 2019. So, you know, there's going to be those challenges coming soon once we hit an El Nino cycle, which the predictions are starting to focus on.
Yeah, that's right. And when you talk about fish kills as well, it's now with this abundance of water, there's concern about carp numbers. Just before we talk about recent commentary about what should be done about the carp, just what is the major impact carp have in the River Murray?
Oh, look, and it's also in the Darling, and even some of the coastal rivers. I mean, carp are really a really difficult invasive species. They breed in really large numbers, and as you mentioned, we're seeing this huge numbers right across the system. They're also, I guess, bottom feeders. They feed on pretty much anything. We've seen a lot of the rivers probably affected in terms of their what we call turbidity, which is where they go cloudy with all the mud that's stirred up, and that's got big issues in terms of wetlands in particular that would clear, and you'd get the light penetrating right to the bottom, and you get vegetation, aquatic vegetation growing, lots of food for small animals and you know, everything from invertebrates to frogs to water birds to native fish. So all of that cycle gets basically affected, plus, you know, there's the big impact of those vast numbers out there competing for food resources.
And then when we come to the commentary about the carp, the New South Wales Nationals Agriculture Minister, they are close to a state election. He has said, well, they should release this carp herpes virus. This was a chestnut of Barnaby Joyce's to go down this path. But I thought this was looked at and they decided not to go ahead with it because they had concerns.
Look, I think, you know, one thing we know about Australia is we made some big mistakes by letting things go. There have been a few successes, but, you know, we all remember cane toads, and they're well and truly still with us. So the last thing we want is damage, and that means, you know, impacts on native fish. There's a lot of concerns of what happens if there's a big kill of carp, and what that would actually do to water quality, because that number of animals dead in the river would cause huge problems in terms of just pollution and the breakdown of carp. There's also concerns about, you know, whether this virus actually can survive in hotter temperatures because of, particularly up in the Darling. And then, like all viruses, we know that the way they go is they evolve so that they don't kill the host. So ultimately, it might not actually deal with the problem in the long term. But look, I think these things are still worth looking at, but we've got to look at them rigorously and make sure we've got all the checks and balances in place.
Now, speaking of water temperatures, there was, because of the water management needs with so much in the elevated regions of the basin, the need to release water from dams. Was there any concern from your point of view as a river ecologist about how that was managed in terms of, we did see some cold water impacts on fish?
Oh, yeah. Look, that's been a long-term problem in the Murray-Darling and in many rivers, because what happens is, particularly high up in the rivers, we've got these large dams and the water is released from the bottom of those dams. And anybody who's been swimming in a big body of water knows it gets pretty cold the deeper you go. And people talk about cold water pollution, that water being released there and sometimes not getting to natural temperatures for some 200 kilometres downstream. And when you think that there's a whole range of things that make rivers tick, like the invertebrates and the native fish, they all are cold-blooded animals. So they need that water temperature to get their activity up, to be able to breed and do all those sorts of things. So cold water pollution is a huge problem. I guess one of the advantages of having a big flood like this is that there was quite a lot of spilling of the dam. So there's water coming in over the top, so that actually the temperatures may not have been as bad as they would have been in a normal year where you're releasing it from the bottom of the dam.
Well, let's just talk about New South Wales again when it comes to their water sharing plans. They've been pulled up, and in fact we spoke with the Inspector General of Water Compliance, Troy Grant, who is a former New South Wales Nationals leader. He says he was part of pulling them up, the government, to get on with these water sharing plans. They seem like a pretty critical mechanism to actually get on with achieving water savings in New South Wales.
Oh, they are. They're an important mechanism. And I guess, the thing and the important value of those is that they're standardised across the rivers of the Murray-Darling, and they have to meet set criteria put in place by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. So, if you like, it's getting away from the parochialism of the states with a bit more of a cop on the beat or an auditor, and the Inspector General plays a very important role in that respect. I think it's really very disappointing that New South Wales hasn't got its act together in terms of water management, and we've generally seen this for some time in terms of the way the rivers have been managed in New South Wales. For example, we've just done some work reviewing the decision-making around Menindee Lakes, and that was a major project put up by the New South Wales Water Agency to save environmental water for the Basin Plan and meet their obligations. But, there were so many poor steps made. The decisions were based on just cherry-picking information that suited, and very little public information that was rigorous, and certainly the local community who we talked to about it were up in arms, and essentially it was just an example of in terms of the environment, robbing Peter to pay Paul in respect of taking water from Menindee, which is a fantastic ecosystem, to just make sure there are more megalitres in the target for environmental flows for the basin.
Yeah, and that's the last point I wanted to touch on, and the big B word that gets bounced around river communities, buybacks, and the adding of water for the environmental purposes. There's a criticism of them, and we're talking often about partial buybacks where farmers might sell a little bit of their water, but just how effective is the buyback strategy in terms of achieving ecological outcomes in the basin?
Look, I think there's definitely good evidence now in terms of the environment for really positive responses with environmental water that's been brought back. So you can look at the Macquarie, you can look at the Murrumbidgee, the Lachlan, the Whydah, and demonstrate, obvious positive responses in terms of native vegetation, native fish species, invertebrates, all the things that you would like to measure in a river system. I think there are some big challenges. We aren't able to, or the Commonwealth isn't able to get the water out into the places it needs to because of constraints in river systems, and it's been very slow in that respect, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, in terms of meeting their obligations of working out how to talk to farmers about doing that. I think there is obviously a lot of criticism about the impact on irrigation communities of the buyback. I have not really seen compelling evidence of the full extent of that impact. And I guess, with all of the buyback that's been talked about, it's not a compulsory thing. It's from willing sellers. And the Commonwealth even recently is talking about lots of people wishing to sell their water. So there is, and I guess the other thing that we sometimes forget is this water that's coming back into the river isn't just about the environment. It's about people getting better fishing. It's about First Nations people getting better drinking water. It's about floodplain graziers getting flooding that they used to have. It's about the fishermen at the bottom of the river. So there's a whole lot of positives that come by having healthy rivers. It sometimes suits people to say this is all about the environment again versus irrigation. Well, it's obviously not that. And I think we need to get away from that sort of simplistic argument.
Excellent, and that's why it's been good to pick your brains on it for a good 10 minutes or so. Professor Richard Kingsford from the University of New South Wales, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on that with us today.
Thanks very much, Ricky.